Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so privileged and honored to be in conversation with Kathy Vargas, our 2024 Lifetime Achievement Award in Visual Arts.
My pleasure.
I have a couple of folks to thank. First, the Art League staff and board. We are a very small team, and so it really takes everyone to make these events happen. The Adaran Foundation for all their support, the Jacques Louis Vidal Foundation, the Diaz family, Joe, Georgina, and Zoe for your constant support, and Wendy Watrous. We also just got Kathy's publication in this week, so I'm gonna plug it. They're available for purchase after this talk. It's Kathy's first publication dedicated solely to her work in about 25 years. She's beautiful. I encourage you to flip through it once we're done. But yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to use that as a jumping board, since Lucy Lepard was gracious enough to pen the essay for this publication, and she titled it A Series of Blessed Accidents. And I want you to talk a little bit about how you ended up getting into art and what the art scene looked like during that time.
Well, I was always drawn to art and to art making. I thought I wanted to be a painter. And I finished high school, and there were no 4-year colleges that had amazing art departments. There were some 4-year colleges in San Antonio. The art departments were good, but it wasn't what I wanted. I graduated in 1968. I was a proud hippie, crazy rebel, free thinker, insane. And I looked around and I didn't see a school I wanted to go to, which is a strange thing. So I thought, okay, I'm going to find a job. Well, I had been hanging out with some of the first, I think, Latino slash Chicano artists. One of them owned a gallery in La Villa. And through him, I met some people who had an animation studio or were just opening an animation studio. They had video. And literally, this was a chain of blessed accidents. They offered me a job. They said, why don't you come in as our receptionist? I'm like, sure, why not? I have no training in anything. And that turned into a job in the animation studio once they opened it. And I ended up being an animator on an Oxbury animation stand, which, if you've ever seen it, was the old one. It was huge, it was tall. I met all kinds of wonderful people and started taking classes at the Mexican Cultural Institute. On my way to class one day, I found my path blocked by a fiesta going on. So I took a side path and ended up meeting a rock star. So that was interesting. That got me into looking at rock and roll photography. I found out that there was a rock and roll photographer who was teaching at one of the small side schools in San Antonio. And so I went there, ended up working with him, doing rock and roll photography. He was fantastic. He was photographing bands like the Rolling Stones, and he had been roommates with Pete Townsend when they'd gone to art school together. So it was a natural fit. It was the same insanity I was used to. And by this time, Mel Casas had arrived at San Antonio College. Mel Casas was one of my huge mentors. And he hadn't been there when I graduated high school. So if I had gone to San Antonio College, I would never have had that experience. But there he was, big time Chicano artist, asked me to join Gonzaga, which I did. And then in the interim, UTSA opened. UTSA didn't open till the early to mid 70s. They didn't get their art department going till about the time I arrived. And so I went there, and it was a whole other reality. I don't know if we want to talk about that now. We can talk about it later. But the bottom line is the Chicano art movement had happened. Before that, the civil rights movement had happened. the women's movement and women's art movement were going on. And my teachers at UTSA were clueless. Mostly, all well, not mostly male, all male, except for the art historians. We had one female art historian. Uh, and the guys were saying things to their Latino students and their female students, things like, well, you don't want to call yourself a Hispanic artist, that's very limiting. You don't want to call yourself a woman artist, you don't want to do women's work, you don't want to be in women's shows, that's very limiting. You'll get, it's like being typecast. And I should say, my parents were both very political. My dad working with his brother, who was a big muckety muck in the Texas Democratic Party. My mom working on a community level with a bunch of rights groups. And I'm sitting here going, but I am a Latina and I am a Chicana and I'm pretty outspoken about it. And I don't think it's at all limiting. So a lot of the students who, here's the thing, and I'm a professor now, so I can say this to Mark's here and he knows it. What you say to your students matters because they see you as an authority figure and they think you know everything, even though you know you don't. They don't know you don't. I always tell my students straight out, I'm not a professor, I'm a teacher. I don't profess a single thing. You guys can tell me what you want to profess, but I believe certain things, but I want to teach you how to make good photographs. And when I was told I couldn't be who I was, I thought, you guys have to be nuts. But here's the thing, it was a happy accident because they believed me. And I taught there for a year and a half, and the chair of the department, who was very different, Miss Jim Broderick, very different from the rest of them, told me when there was a job opening at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. And he said, I think this would be very good for you. And I said, I think you're right. And I applied and I got the job, and that was the happiest accident of my life. So much for happy accident. And I met Lucy there.
There's so much I want to circle back to. But one of the first things that I want to touch on is this transition from documentary photography to directorial mode of focused photography, because that's when a lot of your animation background comes into play, I feel like, in that transition. So can you speak a little bit about why that transition happened and how you've really leaned into your mother's very deep Catholic beliefs and your dad's folk ancestral history?
Well, bottom line, most photographers, when they pick up the camera, photograph the real world. They photograph whatever's out there, whether it's their family and their friends or whatever they find on the street. Some of our first exercises, when my students take documentary one, I tell them to go photograph out in the street. Most photographers don't think, I'm going to make conceptual art now. I'm going to go into the studio with the strobes and work. Yeah, it's what photography is based on. Photography in its early days thought it was reality. It's not, but it really believed it was. And so when I picked up a camera, that's what I photographed. And I photographed my neighborhood. And I lived and still live on the east side of San Antonio, which is African American and Latino. And all my neighbors were African American, Latino, and that's what I photographed. When I joined CONSAFO, that work was very important to them, and that's what I exhibited. And then as time changed, two things happened. First of all, I got jobs. I got part-time jobs, and my timeline became really crunched. So I couldn't be out in the street when the sun was shining all the time. So it's like, okay, time to go into the studio where I can control the light. And so a lot of it was practical. I went into the studio to be able to have more control over what and when I photographed. And then the other thing was that CONSAFO, see, and this is the thing, I don't just get angry at the mainstream. Sometimes I pick on my fellow Latinos too. CONSAFO was saying, your work must look like this. And I'm sitting here going, nobody tells me what my work must look like. My work is both. I love rock and roll, but I also love Agustin Lara, who was one of my mother's favorite Mexican composers. And I also love symphonic music, and I also love salsa, and I also love conjunto music. Tell you who all the conjunto greats are. And the bottom line is, as Latinos in the United States, we are a combination of all those experiences. So when I started to make art, I realized my art was going to be a little bit of everything, a little bit of all those experiences. And so when I started to experiment, it didn't quite sit well with Consafo. What's interesting is that Mel Casas, who invited me to join, invited two of my fellow students to join. Mel Casas was also making conceptual art. He was making Chicano art that was conceptual. This is where mentors come in. So he gave us permission to be whoever the heck we wanted to be. One of the other students he asked was a minimalist. One of the other students he asked was an abstractionist. He was trying to bring that new thinking into the Latino art realm. And so even though I absolutely love and adore all of the artists from the Chicano movement who were making realistically based and very creative renditions of culture, he knew we were going somewhere else. And Mel Casas knew how to pick a fight because he would make these totally anger-provoking paintings, huge things that would talk about brownies of the Southwest. And he would have a little girl in a brownie uniform, but he would also have a migrant worker because the migrant workers were also the brownies of the Southwest. And I learned from him two things. Number one, he gave me permission to be whoever I wanted to be, whether it was a member of Consafo or not a member of Consafo or my own creation. And he gave me permission to pick fights. And that has been wonderful. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but maybe we've moved on to mentors because he was, I think he was one of my first and foremost mentors. My other mentor was Tom Wright, who was the rock and roll photographer. And his insanity was what made us wonderful because he would let us play in the darkroom and do whatever we wanted. And he would have his friend Mick Jagger visiting him in his apartment across the hall. And we would have to kick Mick out of the darkroom because we had a 2-door system. You had to walk through the first door, close it, and walk. And he was too stoned. I shouldn't say that. We'll edit that out. But it's like, okay, here I come. No, out you go. We have to shut the door. And so I was as much a part of the rock and roll world as I was a part of the Chicano world. I was as much a part of the flower child world as I was a part of the political world. And for me, it all came naturally. So that, my time in Consafo was also saying, look, here's who we are becoming. And we Latino Chicanos were becoming a mixture, we're a blend. We're not always going to be just one thing. I'm sure you have that. They're looking at Vicky. I'm sure you have that with African American artists. We have that with artists of all cultures. We're never just one thing. We're always, and we're artists first. If we know what conceptual art is, we're going to make conceptual art. So we become a different breed.
I think that that is a great segue to talk about not only your mentors, but your mentees, because a lot of the things that you shared with us that you've stated that Mel Casas has taught you, I've heard other people say you've taught them that as well. And so one generation at a time, kind of accumulating all this advice and accumulating your own experiences and new advice to give a whole new generation. Because I have heard people tell me that you have taught them how to fight,
Yeah.
And I have seen this, and I was so lucky enough to spend 2 weeks at the American Art Archives at the Smithsonian, flipping through your papers that they house over there, and I came across some letters that you wrote to certain institutions, criticizing them for not having women curators, because without women curators, there weren't women being curated into shows.
Right.
So, can you talk a little bit about that advocacy work and the progress that you've seen happen since then, and the progress that still needs to be made? Because there's still so much work that needs to be done.
Yeah. We were just talking about Joe. Joe cringes, but we were just talking about a panel. We were asked to be on an acquisitions panel for, I won't name the museum. It's not anyone you know. That was purported to be wanting to buy work by people of color, and didn't do that. The panel did not do that. And I told them to take my name off the committee list. I said, you didn't listen to what I had to say. Talk about letters. That one isn't in there yet. But I said, you didn't listen to what I had to say. I suggested wonderful artists, and they were younger. And by younger, I don't mean in their 20s. By younger, I mean in their 40s, and established with good resumes. Didn't even bother to look at them. So, and when they did go, I heard from one of them. She said, "Oh, this woman who came in, I said, wasn't too cute. No, it's just the young curator. The old one stayed home. She didn't want to bother with me. And the young one was just there for about 10 minutes and looked around and said, oh, this is all very dreary and very dark, and walked out. Mm-hmm. And so it has been my experience over and over. When Blue Star was new, they weren't showing artists of color. They weren't showing women. I was in, here's the deal with that time period. UTSA, because it was a relatively new institution and because it had a graduate program, immediately got the stamp of approval. And so if you'd gotten your MFA from that university, it was almost like a straight line to Blue Star. So I was asked to be in a show. And then I realized I'm not represented here very well. I think they had two other Latino artists, and they didn't have many women, unless the women were married to male artists who were also in the show. And well, this went on. At the same time, I was not alone in my activism. We had guerrilla girls, and we had a lovely woman by the name of Glenna Park who fought like crazy for women's rights in the art academy. And they started staging protests, and eventually we got Lucy Lepard, who I had met through the Guadalupe. We got her to come in and curate one of the Blue Star shows, and it okay, the guys hated it, everybody else loved it. So it was fantastic. It was great. Um, and that was the beginning of success. And it wasn't my success, it was our success. It was all of us. It was Glenna, and it was Anita Valencia, and it was a bunch of other women who were willing to stir the pot and who were willing to take the risk of not being asked to exhibit at Blue Star. Because that's what happens when you make noise. And that's what you have to know going in. And that's what I've taught my students. You have to speak. You have to say what's on your mind. You have to call people on what they do. But you also have to be ready to have them cut you out of the equation. Because you are told, you're a troublemaker. I said, no, I'm not a troublemaker. I just want a little more equality. And, we're talking about women artists, but looking at this piece, at the same time, the AIDS crisis was happening. And I had friends who were gay. The art world had artists, even in San Antonio, who were gay. And one of them came up to me and said, we're not accepted by our community. We're not asked to exhibit here. We're not a part of this reality. And I said, show me your work. And so I started visiting studios, and we started exhibiting some of that work. And Franco Mondini, who was first in our Christmas craft sale and then showed with us in an actually a regular exhibit, ended up being at the Whitney Biennial. Mm-hmm. So when people are being left out, even if they're not from your group, when people are being left out, you have to speak up. Mm-hmm. Franco was not a woman. I am not LGBTQ, but we had interests in common, and the interest in common was equality. Mm-hmm. And the interest in common was representation. And so that has to happen too.
That's one of the things I love so much about your career, is that even before the term intersectionality was coined, you were already fighting for inclusivity. And even though the Guadalupe was specifically a center for Latino culture, you made sure that you were showing Asian artists, Black artists, queer artists as well. Can you talk a little bit about how you use the Guadalupe as a platform? Because I know there's a quote in the book where you state that you said you don't want to have power, and someone said, well, you have power, so you should use it for good.
Yeah, when I first got my job at the Guadalupe, I thought, I was an artist. Mm-hmm. First. I had never been an arts administrator, didn't know anything about budgets or anything like that. And I thought, okay, I'm going to see what I can do. This is an interesting mm-hmm. job. I love the place. I respected the place. I said, well, we'll see what I'm allowed to do. Mm-hmm. I'll keep the job for 2 or 3 years. And then I'll go on to whatever's next. Well, I stayed for 15. A friend of mine, Larry DiMartino, sat me down to dinner. And he was very excited. He said, I'm so excited you got that job at the Guadalupe. He said, now, and he was on museum boards. He'd been on the Whitney board in New York. He said, you have power now. And I said, are you nuts? What am I going to do with power? I don't want power. My idea of power was President of the United States. It's like politician power. I don't have power. Yes, you do. You have the power to make change. No, I don't. Yes, you do. You can do all sorts of things now. What are you going to do with that power? He said, it's not power that's scary. It's not power that's evil. It's how you use it. Mm-hmm. And that was the best thing he could have said to me. Mm-hmm. Because I thought, okay, let's think about this. How can I use this? And of course, there were so many young artists out mm-hmm. there who hadn't been included, who okay, go back to curators. If you're going to be a curator, get to know an artist mm-hmm. over time. It's wonderful to do a studio visit. It's a great starting point. If somebody really shocks your world, put them up on the walls immediately. If you're not quite sure, go back and see them in a couple of months. Go back and see them in 6 months. Go back and see them in a year. Continue the relationship and continue the conversation. And that's what I realized could happen. And what I wanted to do was to show work that was vital, period. I didn't have an axe to ground. It didn't have to be traditional. It didn't have to be realistic. It didn't have to be conceptual. It didn't have to be cutting edge. It had to be sensational. And that was all I wanted. And so we found Vincent Valdez. Mm-hmm. And we found a bunch of women artists who had been hiding. We found Diana Rodriguez. We found Vicky. We found, who else did we find? We had a bunch of people, Leticia Huerta, and a bunch of people who were just getting started. Mm-hmm. And who, if nothing else, needed to know that their work was treasured. Mm-hmm. And that their work was important, and that it mattered, and that it needed to have a broader audience. And our audience was all for that. The audience came. And so a lot of it was women, but there were a lot of great male artists too. A lot of it was straight people. There were a lot of lesbian, gay people too. A lot of it was radical people. There were a couple of conservatives too. And it was just, let's join the conversation. Let's allow everybody to have a voice. And we found the most amazing people: Alex Rubio, Vincent Valdez. I could go on and on and on. Huge list of people you may not have heard of because they've all gone into academia now and they tend to be swallowed up, some of them, but it happens. But they're fantastic. They were fantastic, and it was amazing for me. My greatest pleasure as a curator is to walk into a studio and be blown away. And it happened over and over and over because we had a bunch of fantastic artists. And that's all I wanted. That's, that's what I wanted to present. That's what I wanted to show them. I didn't care. You care a little bit about their resumes because you want to think that they're going to keep going. But I'm not going to read your resume first. I'm going to look at your images first. I'm not going to read your resume. I may read it while I'm talking to you, but I'm not going to read your resume before I talk to you, because it's important to have the conversation. And yeah, I keep telling my students that too. And what I try to tell my students is how to present themselves. And I tell them, don't be afraid to tell the truth about who you are or what your concerns are, because you're going to change and that's fine. But you have to never be afraid of being honest with curators. Don't try to figure out what the curator wants. Don't look a curator up and go, oh, they're showing this and this and this, therefore I have to be this. No. You'll find your curator if you keep being who you are.
So at this point, we've talked a little bit about you being an artist.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about you being the visual arts director at the Guadalupe, as a curator, as a professor. You are also a board member. You wrote frequently. You have so many, oh my gosh, so many people know you as so many things, and it's so amazing. Can you talk a little bit how each of those roles have kind of expanded your knowledge of art, and how what that deep understanding of the ecology of our artistic ecosystem looks like?
Actually, it's more expanding my understanding of life, because artists do that for you. If they're good, if they know what they're doing, when you look at their work, your mind should expand to embrace what their ideas are. And they all have different ideas. And so I wrote criticism. One of the first things I did when I got out of graduate school was I was asked by one of our local papers to write, not really criticism, but articles about Latino art and then eventually photography. And that was another way to meet artists. And more than anything, I think it's getting into other heads. All of this, what links all of that practice together to my own artwork, is sharing ideas and getting into other people's heads. I love to talk. I'm bad at crowds. I was horrible last night. I missed a lot of people. Because it's like, oh gosh, you're in the headlights scene. But I love talking to people one-on-one. I love sharing ideas and experiences one-on-one. And when you walk into an artist studio, or when you walk into a museum, or when you walk into a gallery, that's what you're doing. You're sharing ideas one-on-one. And so the link is, let me look around and see what the idea is. I looked at Bailey's work, and the first thing I said, I told her, this is so cold. I'm freezing in here. This is so cold. Well, that's what she wanted me. I think that's what she wanted me to feel, right? And then you understand her hardship in being in that cold, her hardship in working in that cold. And then for me, I always form metaphors. How cold is it in the art world sometimes for artists? how hard is it for them to relentlessly pursue against every obstacle what it is they do. And so your work led me from first sensation, it's cold, to second sensation, it's hard, to third sensation, it's hard for everybody. It's hard for all artists, and yet we persist. And it's beautiful. Your installation is absolutely beautiful, but it's also very scary because of that cold, because that cold is palpable. And that's the world for a lot of artists. That world is people, curators shun you or won't come in or won't visit or, kind of look up their noses at your work and walk out the door in 10 minutes. That's cold. And so when you encounter an artist, even if it's a student artist, I have a young student right now who's not quite getting it, but she's a lovely person. And we sat down and we talked about the nature of photography, what photography was about, what people believe about photography, how she could approach it. We had a conversation, and we had a conversation not only between the two of us, we had a conversation with the medium of photography. And I think that's the other thing to remember is you're having a conversation with the artist, but the artist has had a conversation with their medium. And so it's a three-sided conversation. You and the artist and the actual medium in which they've chosen to present and how that affects their message. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. You brought up your students, and you once told me that one of the projects you give them is to read a couple of headlines from news sources outside of the US.
Yes.
And talk about the imagery there. Can you talk about why that's so important and what media literacy, what my generation and generations younger than me kind of lack in media literacy sometimes?
Well, a lot of the great photojournalists are sadly missing from our reality today. They're still there. They're still doing wonderful work. We just don't see it. Maybe you see it online, but what I make my students do, this is for history of photography, because I teach all of the very different genre of history of photography. And so when we get into documentary, they've already looked at the coverage of the Civil War. They've looked at the coverage of the dead bodies lying in the fields. And so I asked them about how realistic they feel their representation of war is today. And unfortunately, we have lots of wars to pick from. And when I first assigned this, the war in Ukraine had just broken out. And there were images of dead bodies, and a lot of them were children. And so the assignment I give is to go to the BBC. I don't let them go to a US news media because we don't cover a lot of international news. I don't let them go to the right wing or the left wing because I don't want this to be about politics. I want this to be about what's going on in the world and your reaction to it, not what you're told to think, but come to your own conclusion. And so they have to look at work and they have to decide what it makes them feel. And then after they feel, they have to read the story and see what it makes them think. And they have to start dealing with world events, not just local or not just national, because we generally already have our biases about local and national events. I wanted them to have to reach out to something they might not know about. And the idea is that, well, the idea honestly came from James Nachtwey. I don't know if any of you know his work. If you don't, go to TED Talks, look up James Nachtwey. He is amazing because he's my age. He came of age during the civil rights movement. He came of age during the war in Vietnam. And he was watching this on the news, and he was watching the impact that coverage had on people's lives. Mm-hmm. And he became a news journalist, a news photographer. Mm-hmm. And he said that he felt that as a news photographer, he could change the world. Mm-hmm. And he could make people see and feel a certain way. And that to me was, oh my God, you're not just taking objective photos. This is one of the things that mm-hmm. people always think about photography. Oh, the photographer is objective. It's all of this. No. Mm-hmm. Photographer's right there. And other photographers have said about him, he was covering a famine in Somalia. And there was a woman trying to take a child into the doctor's tent, and she couldn't make it. And she was about to drop the child. And he put his camera down and went and picked up the child and carried him in his arms. It's a picture of him carrying the child in his arms to the doctor's tent. And the thing is, reporters and photographers, they're not supposed to get involved like that. Mm-hmm. You're not supposed to become the story. But he became the story in that moment because he wanted that child's life to be saved. Mm-hmm. And that tells you where he's coming from. And so for me to tell students to look mm-hmm. at reportage images is, what responsibility are you taking? Are you going to be the ones to pick up the child and take him into the tent? Or are you just going to look at the images and be totally unmoved? There are a lot of images out there that are affecting us in many ways. And we have to make intelligent decisions about what we're seeing. We have to look at the pictures and we have to read the story. And then we have to decide. By the way, we were going to say this. Elections are coming up.
Yes. Tomorrow is the last day to register to vote in Texas. So we encourage you to look it up. You can go on their website and make sure you are your registration is up to date, which is a great transition into politics. Since a lot of your work is political, every single one of these series in here is quite a political piece. Can we talk about the current political climate, how in November it will be decided whether or not we have our first female president or a president who puts reproductive rights in jeopardy, and how you feel like your generation's progress that you've made for my generations and countless others is at risk of taking a couple steps back.
Well, whatever progress we made is pretty much gone. We had the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Mm-hmm. We have the overturning of admissions to college that are to help students of color who may not have had the advantages financially, economically, culturally, to really, and certainly financially. The kids I worked with on the West Side in San Antonio are not going to get into Harvard and be able to pay tuition. They may get into Harvard, they may get accepted, they're not going to pay tuition. Two of those kids that got scholarships under the old law are now the Castro brothers, who are very well known in Texas. One of them, well, mm-hmm. you guys know who mm-hmm. they are. But the bottom line is that's coming to an end. Mm-hmm. Women's rights are coming to an end. Women, I made my little statement last night. I didn't want to tick too many people off. Women
they had to hear it.
Women are not being given not only the credit for their ideas, but the encouragement of their ideas and the opportunity. And there's a whole new movement now to have wives and mothers. Well, we've always had wives and mothers. Kamala Harris is mm-hmm. a wife, and she was a mom to the children she mm-hmm. got through her marriage. Mm-hmm. But the bottom line is, I'm a shameless, childless cat lady. The bottom line is, I have 1 million children because all of my students are my mm-hmm. children. Vincent Valdez is my art son. Alex Rubio is my art son. Lisette Chavez is my art daughter. So, bottom line, it doesn't matter whether you're married with children or not. You're still going to be out there looking out for children, and males should be doing it too, not just females. And we don't see that encouragement anymore. We don't see the encouragement to have women be strong role models from the right that I can see. We see the encouragement to be wives and have lots of babies. And that's part of what the overturning of Roe v. Wade is about. And it's wonderful to have children if you want them. Working on the West Side, unfortunately, I saw women who didn't want them. And I saw what happened to those children. And a lot of them became mothers who had children who didn't want them. And it goes on over and over generationally. And by the way, while I was at the Guadalupe, Pope Paul VI came to speak at the plaza and tell all of the women how wonderful it was that they had all these babies. And I'm sitting here going, oh my God, no, because these are a lot of good Catholics. It's like, no, birth control, right over there. Why didn't we have a birth control station? Why didn't we have condoms sitting in a pile over here? Because it's one thing to be religious and spiritual, and it's another thing to be responsible. And going back to politics, if we weren't already there, politics has to be for everybody. And women have to be allowed to dream, and they need to be supported in their dreams. People of color need to be allowed to dream and to be supported in their dreams. And sometimes, I mean, we talk about African American reparation, we're nowhere near there. Sometimes we still need to deal with those things. All of these photographs are about the women in my life, me, that's me as a baby. And these women, except for me, were all immigrants. And now, under the last administration, we had babies separated from their parents at the border. So what would have happened to me if somebody had said, you go over here, we don't know what's going to happen to you, but, and these women, you guys go on your way. Or my mother, my mother, when she came into the country, was around 5 years old. What if she had been taken away from her parents? All of these are pictures of women because, except for one little boy who's in there somewhere, but the reason it's all women is because their men were killed in the Mexican Revolution. All of them. My grandfather, my great grandfather, one of my great uncles, and a friend of the family. They were all killed by the revolutionaries during the Mexican Revolution. So the women and small children, I think the oldest male they had was 14 years old. He was the one who went to identify the bodies. I had the paperwork where he swore out the statement that yes, these were his father, his grandfather, etc. And the women packed all the kids into a wagon and started heading for the border. And it took them a couple of years to get there. And then they waited in Laredo for another couple of years to get permission. And they crossed legally. My grandmother always had a green card. She never wanted to become a citizen of the United States, but she always had a green card. And I think about the insanity going on at the border right now. And I think about what's going on in the world to cause that insanity, the drug cartels, the bad governments, the dishonesty. We had a cleaning lady at Incarnate Word because my own mother and grandmother were cleaning ladies. I always talk to the cleaning ladies. And one of the cleaning ladies said to me, oh, I lived in Mexico. I'm a Mexican citizen, but I came here because my ranch was taken over by the cartels. Cartels came in with guns one day. They said, we need your land. And they got rid of her. And so here she was, and she came over and she's working as a cleaning lady. She said, but my daughter is here too, and my daughter has gone to college. And that's the next generation. And that's what matters. And so we have more immigrants than we realize. And what's more, their kids are doing great. And we have to look at all of that politics, all of that agenda against women, against people of color, against newcomers from all countries. And we have to say, what exactly do we want? How do we, the people, want to deal with that? Because we forget that this country is about us. And yeah, we have to elect the right politician, but even if we elect the right politician by our view, we have to stay on top of them. We have to say, okay, what are you doing now that you're in office? You have to say to them the same thing Larry DiMartino said to me. You have power now. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to make things better? That's our responsibility.
I think it may be time to open it to the audience for questions. I know we didn't really talk about technique within your work or things like that, but if anyone has any questions,
yeah, I'll answer.
I will.
A long, long time ago, you once said to me, we were talking about aesthetics, and you said, women conceal, men reveal.
Yeah.
Do you still feel
So,
that way?
sometimes. Not always, sometimes. I think women are getting more out there. Thank you, Kamala Harris. I don't think she's concealing a damn thing. But bottom line, women were taught to hold back a little. And so when I first started making these images, they're double exposures, but they're also layers. So if you take the time, you can peel back one layer and look beneath that, peel back another. You eventually get to the core, and then you have to put it all back together to see what it means. But yeah, women tended to be more circumspect, more roundabout in what they did. And men were always, well, men have always been taught to be aggressive. And women have always been taught to be nurturing and step back a little. And so this is certainly when I started, that's the latest work. It doesn't have any double exposures in it. Okay, it's all out there because it's about third world workers who are getting taken advantage of, underpaid, etc. Sometimes you just got to put it out there.
Any additional questions?
See, I've answered all their questions.
I know, you're so thorough. Oh, yes.
Kathy, I just want to say that I'm very touched.
You're welcome. You are welcome.
I too went to San Antonio Community College.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah.
I also went to community college in
Okay.
San Antonio and UTSA.
Okay. Yeah.
And I did show my work at Guadalupe when you were there.
Yeah.
And I have very fond memories of you. It's been so many decades.
Oh.
When I saw your
I'm
name
glad.
that you were going to be talking,
I'm glad.
I felt so happy, and I'm very, very happy.
It's good to reconnect. Yes, I remember you.
Yes. So
yeah.
it's wonderful that you're doing this work. We need it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, did somebody else have a question?
Just more of a thought. I really like. Am I loud enough?
Yeah.
So I really like how you said you have to speak, but you also have to be ready to be removed from the equation. I'm Central American, specifically Salvadorian, and I find that in a lot of Latino spaces, we're actually excluded from them too. So I think I've been very outspoken about that. I've been, part of boards that are specific for Latinos, and when I speak up about the exclusion of my community, that's perceived as like, oh, you don't want to be part of like the Latino team.
No.
So that really resonated with me because I am a Sagittarius, so I bring that fire energy, but I don't think that's always welcome. And granted, I'm not a photographer. I am a social worker, therapist, and I also write. But in these spaces that I'm a part of, I often talk about that because I think sometimes we do a disservice in ways that we try to like group different communities into one group. When there's a bunch of different experiences, I mean, we even change within generations, right? Like I look at folks that are I'm fourth generation, but I look at folks that are like folks in our second generation, how those dynamics start to change too. But anyways, just wanted to say I really like that because I think sometimes I'm like there's times where it feels like it's easier to stay quiet, but in doing that, we just kind of start repeating the same thing, excluding the same folks, and it just becomes a lot of the same.
You've hit on one of my newer pet peeves. Keep speaking up, because the Latino community is huge, and there should be different voices from different places with different backgrounds and different realities and different concerns. And that the Latino community also has to keep moving forward. As I said, I'm not just picking on the mainstream. I have recently, I sent Joe a long email about the fact that we have maybe 5 or 6 acknowledged Chicano curators, and they all keep repeating the same 5 or 6 artists who are all now in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, some of them. And it's like, well, what are you going to do for Vincent? What are you going to do for Alex? And what are you going to do for Ana Laura de la Garza? And what are you going to do for Joanna Samarron? And what are you going to do for the people whose names aren't that well known? And the same thing goes for what are you going to do for the people who are from a different place where you may speak the same language, but you don't have the same culture. And you have different music, and you have different habits and different interests. And that you have to keep picking at the Latino community to expand, to include you, because otherwise it's an erroneous picture of the Latino community. And that's my point, is we have to keep poking at the mainstream, but we also have to keep poking at our own communities to say, is everyone represented? Is everyone in the circle? Has everyone been given a voice? Has everyone been included? We can't keep it small.
Okay. I think that's a wonderful place to end the talk. So thank you so much, Kathy.
Bye.